And welcome back. Let's continue work on our game. Let's go ahead and start tidying a couple things up here. First thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to go over to my hierarchy. I'm going to go ahead and click the eyeball here on my camera just so I can get those camera lines out of the way. It doesn't remove them from the game. As you can see, they're still here. They're still functioning. But it just makes it so when I'm working here in the game space, I don't have to worry about those lines getting in the way. Now, we have seen this before where we start manipulating our player object, and one of the things that happens is sometimes it veers off to the side or starts tumbling and stuff like that. And there's a way we can kind of restrict that is in a rigid body here. We actually have this ability called constraints, and the constraints are going to allow us to freeze positions. And so if we look at the way our player is set up right now, we have, of course, our X direction this way, we have our Y direction this way. You can see it very easily from our coordinates here. But we, of course, have the Z direction, which is moving out this way. And that's not necessarily the direction I want this player object to go. So I can actually come in here and say, hey, I want to freeze that Z position so that way it's no longer able to shift that way. In fact, let's just go ahead and save that right now. Now, if I take a look at my player, you can see right now the Z direction not set to 0. If I set that to 0, you can see it does offset off my base here a little bit. So that's okay if this is not, we just want to make sure that this is locked into wherever this is going to be. Like if I wanted this to be 0, I could, of course, if I set this to 0, I would just need to make sure I go to my barrels here and make sure that those are all both. And I can see these are not set to 0. So if I set those to 0, that should give me a little bit closer view to what I'm actually looking for. So you can see that should get us to a little bit closer to actual center here. I'm just going to kind of do more of a top-down view so we can see. There, that looks pretty good. So now that everything is zeroed out, that is pretty good. Let's go back, though, to our player rigid body and kind of do a little bit more cleanup there as well. So one of the things that we had done, we had already froze the position. Now, occasionally, we might have things where this might start tumbling. If it bumps into something or, if we start pressing other keys. For our purposes for this game, we don't want the player to be able to rotate. For example, if I go to rotation here, we can see I only want it to really be able to move up and down, all right? Because we're going to simply be steering this object from one platform to the next. I am not interested in, for example, it to steer away from me for now. We're not getting into that third-dimensional space right now, or getting into having a ability where this ship is going to rotate in this direction. So I don't want those. I simply want to keep it in this case to what direction is it? If you look at this is that blue line, which means this is my Z direction, which means I actually want to freeze rotation on both the X and the Y. And so then that should lock that ship in so that we when I actually go to play this, all right, when I start moving this, this should eliminate any potential movements that are causing this. Now, it is still kind of going backwards sometimes if I'm not careful, so that might be something I have to adjust later on, but that should at least eliminate some of the potential issues with, for example, my rocket ship tumbling off into the distance or stumbling on certain things. Now, let's go ahead and set it up in our game world so we can start adding a little bit of challenge here. So right now we are simply going from platform A to B, but we want maybe just a little bit more challenger. So I'm actually going to go ahead down into my assets here, and let's go ahead and find some of these existing prefabs. So go into our props. I'm going to go to the barrels here, and we already used this barrel before as kind of our platform. So maybe I want something else that's going to stimulate a obstacle sign. So I'm just going to grab this one right here, bring this in, and you can see right now, let's just reset that transform position just a little bit here, and we're going to go ahead and scale that up. Let's make that size 10 by 10, just to make that a little bit larger so we can kind of get a good view of what this is, and make it 10 in the Z direction. There we go. Now we have a kind of nice, good obstacle that we can work with. So let's go ahead and just bring that in, and we're going to maybe set this up so it's just something in the middle here. Maybe something that the player has to fly up and over. And of course, we can manipulate around with these. We can, for example, I might say, maybe I want this to be much bigger in the Z direction. Maybe I want to make that, let's say, 15. So it really stretches back there, make like 20 units so we can really get a good feel of how this object is going to go here. And I can even set it up. Maybe I don't want it all the way poking out. Maybe I just want something, just a basic thing that's kind of sitting here in the middle of the field. So when the player has to fly, they have to make sure that they go up and over here. And then they're able to, of course, they might have to stick that landing just a little bit more here. You get the idea. So we have something here now that's in the way that the player is going to have to deal with. I might want to adjust that maybe just a little bit here. bring that back into the direction where I want everything to go. But it gives me something to kind of play around with, to toy with just a little bit. But now that this, of course, exists in here, we, of course, have a obstacle. So I'm just going to go ahead and rename this here. Oh, let's not duplicate. I want to rename first. And I'm just going to call this the barrier. Just so I have something that I can work with. And again, I can manipulate, play around with this. Now, what I can do once I've finished playing around with this and getting to where I want this to be is I can go ahead and start adding in different pieces. Now, this, of course, has a collider on it, so that, of course, works great. So that means that the player can bump into it. But if it didn't have a collider, I would need to simply come in here and make sure I add that collider and then add any additional restraints or things like that I might want to do with it. Again, they're just things that you might have to think about as the player or the designer here of your level. Maybe, if you had something that was more rounded, you might want a different type of collider. For example, let me just bring this up real quick. You might have to use something, for example, like a capsule collider, which is going to give you much more of a rounded object. So that might work really well, for example, for something that is, let's say, something that's going to, let's say, be like a barrel or something like that you can kind of work around. Give you more of that pill shape that is going to kind of give you some of those different edgings. Well, this is very much more box shaped, so giving it with that box collider actually ends up working really well in this case. Now, the next thing we want to kind of take care of here in our challenge, of course, is when we have this player object, sometimes when we start moving, you might notice have the physics engine might start taking over on what we want things to be. So sometimes this happens when we have collisions, sometimes this doesn't happen, and so we need to kind of clean this up a little bit here, so that way we can ultimately have the full control over this player. All right, and so if we look inside of our player movement script here, we of course have in here two different things. We have our upward process and we have our rotation process. And so what we want to do is be able to come in here and adjust these so that way our rotations are set in such a way that they can work correctly. And so what we can do is right here is where we are saying we have the power to rotate, but there's a problem. And basically what it is if there's any kind of existing physics that's going on, it's going to kind of try to fight with this. So the easiest way to solve this is right before we go in and start inputting some of these values is we're just going to go to our rigid body, which in this case is player RB. And we're going to simply tell it to freeze the rotation. And then we're going to tell it to true. And what that does is says to the game, hey, at this point, I don't want you to be in control of this anymore. I am going to take control. And so then we can, of course, once we're done with that, we want to make sure that we shut that freezing back to off. So we want to make sure we set that to false because we want the physics engine to resume control of that. Same thing's going to happen down here for the right side inputs. So I'm actually just going to copy that and bring it on down. And so again, this is going to, if we give a left side input, it's going to freeze the physics engine, allow us to instead give it our own input, and then of course do a freeze rotation this way. And then this is if we're on the right side input, so if we're pressing the right side key, it'll control things that way. All right, and so now if I go ahead and press run, one of the things that will happen is you'll notice that my taking off process is a lot more smooth now. I have a lot more, it feels like a lot more control over what is going on. We still have some weird tumbling and stuff going on, which is okay, but our player object is now established in a way that feels like much more in control. But we still might have to fine-tune some control, and some of this also just might be my own skill level here. But it does give us it feels a lot better now with trying to navigate using this, and that's because again we're no longer having the physics system fighting with our input system. All right, next thing, just for a little quick housekeeping, let's because our barrier here is something that was a different prefab, we're going to go ahead and add that into our own prefabs folder here. So I'm just going to go ahead and drag that in here, and so we'll create a prefab variant. So we'll do that, the same thing here with our barrels. Let's actually go ahead and make variants of those as well, just so that we have those available to us for our different purposes. In fact, I'm going to actually take this other barrel out of here and actually make that into a duplicate here. So then I could just slide that on over. So it's back over into the right-hand side of the field. And just make sure that looks pretty close to about where we had before. Doesn't have to be exact. I just need it kind of to exist there. Let's make that, I'm just going to type it in 16.5. There we go, nice and easy. All right, so that is, of course, a quick little bit of cleanup. Now, the other thing we want to do is a little bit of dampening here. And so in here we have linear and angular dampening. And notice angular dampening is, of course, set by default, but we don't have any linear dampening. A good way to think about linear dampening is kind of like a wind resistance. So as our ship is coming up, it's going to kind of give some pushback to some of these inputs. Now, you're not seeing very much with 1, but let's just go ahead and crank that, let's say, up to 10. And just see if we get any more effect. And you can see how much more, like, slower my inputs are. You can play around with that to find a value you want. I probably don't want my ship going quite this close, because that's a little too slow. Let's try like 5 here. All right, so now if we do this one, you can see we have kind of, if you want kind of maybe a more steady approach, you have that ability as well. So you'll be able to play around with that, find the value that you think works good for you. I'm just going to make this 2 just to kind of get a good feel of that. That feels okay, not too fast. You're going to find a level that probably works best for you. And so you'll have to just play around with that to get to whatever value you are most comfortable with. And this might be okay just as a kind of like, hey, here's a testing value for me. And I'm just going to angle that up just a little bit here. Maybe we can make our landing this time. And, oh, we are going to tumble. Okay, well, we planted nose first. I don't think that's probably the best landing in the history of time. But I'm just going to make it like 1.5 just to give it a little bit more speed to that. Now, the last thing I want to show here is in our project settings, we can actually go and manipulate gravity. And the way we do this is we go down to our physics here and our layer collision matrix. You can see there's a thing called gravity. And by default, it's set to this negative 9.81, which is Earth's gravity. If I were to change this, let's just say this like negative 5, what that's going to do is just effectively reduce how gravity behaves. So let me just go ahead and leave that there. I'm going to press play. And so when I press up, you'll see it takes longer for our objects to come down. And so that's something that you might also play with. So if I come in here, let's just say I'm going to make this positive 5 and I press play, one of the things you'll notice is that it takes kind of off on its own because you're using 5 forces going positive. So something you might want to play with, if I make this, let's say, minus 20, seemingly something that might have even more gravity, you can see I'm having trouble even lifting off here now. So again, these are values to play with. I'm just going to make mine minus 5 here because, actually, let's do like minus 4 just to, give a nice good pushback. So you see it's a gradual decrease here. So we can still take off at a pretty good rate, but it's going to come down a little bit slower. So this might be good if you're trying to simulate something more like, let's say, like the moon, or like maybe a base in space where it has reduced gravity. So you can do that. So you can still get that initial thrust going up, but you might have something where maybe the coming back down is just a little slower. But I think this is good setup here for what we want to kind of get things going. We've done a couple little bits of cleanup to help with control, and I think that's going to be good for us moving forward.